How the Vikings Conquered England Introduction. In the late 8th century, the people of England believed the sea protected them. For generations, kingdoms rose and fell across the British Isles, but life followed a familiar rhythm. Monasteries stood as centers of faith, villages thrived through farming, and kings fought each other for land and power. Then, without warning, strange ships appeared on the horizon. Their sails were unlike anything the English had seen before. Their warriors carried axes, swords, and round shields. They arrived quickly. They struck without mercy, and before anyone could organize a defense, they were gone. To the people of England, these men seemed to come from nowhere. They were the Vikings. Within less than a century, they would do far more than raid coastal villages. They would conquer kingdoms, defeat armies, change the political map of England forever. But how did a relatively small population from Scandinavia achieve what many powerful empires never could? To answer that question, we must begin in the frozen lands of the North, where the story of the Vikings truly began. Chapter 1. Who were the Vikings? The Vikings did not think of themselves as one nation. They came from what is now Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, lands of rugged mountains, dense forests, deep fjords, and long, unforgiving winters. Life there was difficult. Good farmland was limited, population slowly grew, and competition for land and wealth became increasingly intense. For many young warriors, the sea offered opportunities that home could not. The Vikings were extraordinary shipbuilders. Their longships were among the most advanced vessels of their time. Fast, flexible, and capable of sailing both across open seas and deep into rivers, these ships allowed Viking warriors to strike where enemies least expected. They could appear suddenly, attack within minutes, and disappear before local forces had time to respond. But the Vikings were more than raiders. They were skilled traders, explorers, craftsmen, and settlers. They traveled as far as North America in the west and the Byzantine Empire in the east, creating trade networks that stretched across much of Europe. What made them especially dangerous was their willingness to adapt. If a place was rich, they traded. If it was weak, they attacked. If it was worth keeping, they settled. England would eventually become all three. Chapter 2. The Raid. That shocked Europe. For years, the kingdoms of England had fought one another. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex. Each kingdom had its own king, its own army, and its own ambitions. Although they shared a common culture and Christian faith, they were rarely united. Rivalries between kings often mattered more than the threat of a foreign enemy. That division would prove disastrous. In the year 793 AD, a small monastery on the island of Lindisfarne became the target of a raid that would change European history. Lindisfarne was no ordinary monastery. It was one of the holiest places in England, famous for its monks, precious manuscripts, and religious treasures. Few people imagined anyone would dare attack such a sacred place, but the Vikings did not see it the same way. To them, monasteries were perfect targets. They were wealthy, poorly defended, and filled with gold, silver, and valuable religious objects. When the Viking longships reached the shore, the attack was swift. The monks had almost no chance to defend themselves. Some were killed where they stood. Others fled in panic. Many treasures disappeared aboard the Viking ships before local forces could even react. The raid lasted only a short time, yet its impact was enormous. News spread quickly across Europe. Christian writers described the attack as a sign of divine punishment. People spoke of terrifying warriors arriving from the sea without warning. For many, it felt as though a new age of fear had begun, and they were right. Lindisfarne was only the beginning. Over the following decades, Viking ships appeared again and again along the English coast. At first, these were seasonal raids. The warriors attacked during the warmer months, took what they could carry, and returned to Scandinavia before winter. English kings hoped the attacks would eventually stop. Instead, they became larger, better organized, and far more ambitious. The Vikings were no longer satisfied with treasure alone. Soon, they would come for something far greater, the land itself. Chapter 3. The Great Heathen Army. Everything changed in 865 AD. Instead of a few ships carrying raiders, England witnessed the arrival of something completely different. A massive Viking force landed on its shores. The English would later call it the Great Heathen Army. Unlike earlier raids, these warriors had not come simply to steal gold or silver. They had come to stay. Historians still debate the exact size of the army, but there is no doubt that it was unlike anything England had faced before. It included experienced warriors from across Scandinavia, many led by famous Viking leaders whose names would become legendary. According to later tradition, several commanders were the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, including Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba. Whether every detail of those stories is true remains uncertain. What is certain is that these leaders were brilliant military commanders. Instead of attacking random villages, they followed a clear strategy. They captured key towns, secured food supplies, forced local rulers into surrender, and when necessary, they destroyed any army that stood in their way. One kingdom after another began to fall. Northumbria collapsed first. Its capital, York, became one of the Vikings' greatest strongholds. Soon after, East Anglia suffered the same fate. Its king, Edmund, refused to submit. He was captured and executed, later becoming remembered as a Christian martyr. Mercia struggled to resist, but also lost much of its power. Within only a few years, the balance of power in England had completely changed. The Vikings controlled enormous territories. Many people believed it was only a matter of time before all of England belonged to them. Only one kingdom still refused to surrender, Wessex. And there, a young king was preparing for the greatest challenge of his life. Chapter 4. Alfred the Great fights back. By the late 9th century, it seemed that England's fate had already been decided. Northumbria had fallen. East Anglia had fallen. Much of Mercia was under Viking control. Only one kingdom remained unconquered, Wessex. Its king was a young ruler named Alfred. Unlike many kings before him, Alfred understood that simply meeting the Vikings in open battle would not be enough. They were experienced warriors, quick to adapt, and impossible to predict. If England was going to survive, it needed a completely different strategy. At first, even Alfred struggled. In 878 AD, the Viking leader Guthrum launched a surprise winter attack, catching the kingdom off guard. Alfred was forced to flee with only a handful of loyal followers, hiding in the marshes of Somerset, while much of Wessex fell into enemy hands. For a moment, it looked as though the last independent English kingdom had finally been defeated. But Alfred refused to surrender. From his hidden refuge, he quietly gathered supporters. Messengers traveled across Wessex, calling warriors to fight once more. Farmers, local nobles, and experienced soldiers answered the call. Within months, Alfred had assembled a new army. The two sides finally met at the Battle of Edington. It became one of the most important battles in English history. The fighting was fierce. For hours, neither side gained a decisive advantage. Then Alfred's disciplined shield wall held firm, while the Viking attack slowly lost momentum. For the first time in years, the Great Heathen Army suffered a major defeat. Guthrum retreated to a nearby fortress, but Alfred surrounded his forces and cut off their supplies. With no hope of escape, the Viking leader surrendered. The victory changed everything. Instead of seeking revenge, Alfred made a remarkable decision. He negotiated peace. Guthrum agreed to accept Christianity, was baptized, and signed a treaty recognizing Alfred's rule over Wessex. The remaining Viking-controlled lands became known as the Danelaw, where Scandinavian customs and laws continued to shape everyday life. England had not driven the Vikings away, but it had stopped their complete conquest, and Alfred's victory gave the English kingdoms something they had lacked for generations. Hope. Chapter 5. Did the Vikings really conquer England? The answer depends on how we define conquest. The Vikings never ruled all of England, but they conquered enough of it to transform the country's future forever. For decades, large parts of northern and eastern England remained under Viking control. Scandinavian settlers founded towns, farmed the land, traded with local communities, and built new lives far from their Scandinavian homeland. Their influence spread far beyond the battlefield. Thousands of Old Norse words entered the English language. Many towns still carry Viking names ending in by, Thorpe, or Thwaite. Laws, customs, and even place names survived long after the battles had ended. The conflict also transformed the English themselves. The Viking invasions forced rival kingdoms to cooperate in ways they never had before. Without the Viking threat, England might never have united into a single kingdom. Ironically, the invaders helped create the nation they had hoped to conquer. The story did not end with Alfred. More Viking kings would later rule England, including the famous Canute the Great, whose North Sea empire stretched across England, Denmark, and Norway. For a time, England was ruled by a Viking dynasty, yet even that empire eventually disappeared. The Vikings did not simply vanish. They settled, married local people, adopted Christianity, became part of the societies they had once attacked. The fearsome raiders, who had arrived in longships, gradually became farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and rulers. Their age of conquest came to an end, but their legacy never did. Even today, more than 1,000 years later, the influence of the Vikings can still be found in the language, culture, and history of England. Their ships are gone, their kingdoms have disappeared. But the story of how a small group of seafaring warriors crossed the North Sea and changed the course of English history remains one of the greatest stories ever told.